Our next speaker is Jake Conroy. He is a longtime activist, designer, and writer based in San Francisco. He has been involved in a wide range of activism since 1995. In his talk today, Jake will speak about his involvement in SHAC USA and the repression they experienced from the US government and corporate investigators, as well by the Bureau of Prisons while incarcerated. He will discuss being the target of a multi-agency terrorism investigation, learning he was on high-profile prisoners list, and navigating living a life branded as a terrorist in post-9/11 society. Please welcome Jake Conroy.
Hello. All right. I hope my talk's as exciting as that introduction. Thank you. This stage is kind of intimidating. I'm waiting for like pyrotechnics and explosions and like guitar players to come out, which would be pretty awesome. So I want to thank everyone for having me here. I'm pretty excited to be here. This is my first time in Luxembourg and at the conference. As the introduction said, my name is Jake. I'm from San Francisco, California in the United States. I've been doing activism for a couple of decades now. But my main focus has always been on animal issues. I've always been drawn to the plight of non-human animals, basically because I feel like they're the biggest underdog in the world, and I've always had an affinity for the underdogs. So when I was 18, I moved from the East Coast of the United States to the Pacific Northwest. And if anyone knows about the history of radical activism in the in the United States, the Pacific Northwest is where everyone instantly became radicalized when they got involved in organizing. So that's basically what happened to me. I got involved in animal activism, started working with a group called the Northwest Animal Rights Network. We did a lot of successful campaigns against fur stores. I started doing organizing hunt sabs against a whale hunt that was going on off the coast of Washington State in the United States, sabbing whale hunts. And in 2001, I ended up moving across the country again, back to the East Coast to work and help start the office for Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty USA, or SHAC USA, to help organize the campaign to close down the notorious animal testing laboratory, Huntingdon Life Sciences. Let's see here. So, for those of you who might not know about SHAC, I'm assuming a lot of you may, some may not. But SHAC stands for Stop Huntingdon Animal Cruelty. It was a campaign to shut down a laboratory called Huntingdon Life Sciences, and it was a real no-nonsense grassroots campaign that, in the United States at least, was run very horizontally with a real heavy emphasis on autonomy. But we weren't just targeting the laboratory; we were targeting everyone that associated with the laboratory. With the idea that certain companies like laboratories need certain things to stay open, right? So they need an internet provider, and they need an insurance company, and they need suppliers, and they need people to fill the toilet paper in their bathrooms. And if we start picking away at those corporations and those companies that are supplying the laboratory, one by one, we'll start pulling the bricks out of the foundation of Huntingdon Life Sciences. And as we pull one brick out and Huntingdon was trying to patch it up, we'd pull out another and another and another, and eventually the whole foundation would fall in on top of them. And that's essentially what happened. At the beginning of this campaign, Huntingdon Life Sciences was selling on the stock exchange in the United States for about $30 US, and at the height of the campaign, it was worth just mere pennies. So, but with a no-nonsense campaign like that, we saw a lot of victories, but we also saw a lot of repercussions and a lot of government repression. So as an activist, I think we all kind of experience a large amount of, or maybe just a small amount of repression throughout our various activities that we're doing and our organizing and our campaigns. And when we first started doing SHAC in the United States, it all seemed pretty typical, things that we were kind of used to, being followed to and from demonstrations, some video surveillance. Eventually, we'd be the target of lawsuits and injunctions and that sort of thing. But as the campaign increased and the strategies and the tactics increased, we also found that the surveillance and the repression increased as well. For instance, we found in our PO box, our post office box where we received all our mail, there was a post-it note on the inside that we popped off, and it said that they were required to hold all of our mail to be sorted through before it was given to us in the PO box. Our mailman was told that he needed to photocopy the envelopes of every piece of mail that came to our house, so that the government could know who was sending us mail and who we were sending mail out to. We talked to our garbage man, and he told us that he was being paid by private investigators to keep our garbage bags separate from the rest so that they could dig through them and try to find information. So we would add extra dirty kitty litter and a blast of pepper spray before tying up the bags and throwing it away. We found that the government was opening up fake corporations with fake web pages and enticing us with tips and leads to tell us that these were the next big financiers in Huntingdon Life Sciences in order for the government to figure out how we were doing our research and targeting corporations. They were starting to make small donations, like of $1 or $2 by check, so that they could try to figure out where we were doing all of our banking and keeping all of our money. In 2003, we had, we lived in our office, so our home was our office was our home. And a friend of ours was staying in our house, and at 6 o'clock in the morning, she was getting up to go to school. She came running into my room, and she said, "There's cops all over the front yard." And sure enough, the whole front yard was littered with officers and law enforcement agencies. And they were pounding on the door. And we opened up the door, and they had a search warrant to come and raid the house. And so they spent better part of 8 hours going through the entire house, picking what they wanted to take and confiscate. And the search warrant was really broad and not very specific. It would basically say that they were allowed to take anything that had anything to do with animal rights. Well, of course, when you're living in an animal rights office, everything has to do with animal rights, right? So, but that didn't stop them from taking personal journals, baby pictures, letters to and from partners. And they packed it up all into these boxes, and after 8 hours, they loaded them into some trucks, and they drove away with them. And before they left, the head investigator took me aside, and he got in my face trying to intimidate me, and he said, "I want you to know that we're coming for you." And I'm, being the smartass I am, I laughed in his face, and he got angry, and he stormed out of the house, and that was the end of that. But we knew that when the FBI makes a threat, that they follow through on it, right? So as the campaign pushed on, at the time I think we were targeting Marsh Incorporated, which was Huntingdon Life Sciences corporate insurer. And there were some really amazing activities going on all over the country and all over the world against Marsh. Kind of in the background, we were also building up our legal defense because we knew that something was eventually going to come down the road. And that came about a year later. We had picked up our office and we had moved from New Jersey. If anyone's familiar with the United States, I would suggest never going to New Jersey because it's the worst place in the world. And we moved to California, which apparently is supposed to be the best place in the world. So we're all living in California, and we get a phone call about 4 o'clock in the morning, and the phone's ringing and ringing and ringing. And we had been doing this for about 5 years, right? So we're about 5 years into our campaign, working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week for 5 years. So when the phone rings at 4 a.m., no one wants to get up and pick it up, right? No one's getting out of bed. But it kept ringing and ringing. So I get out of bed, and I pick up the phone, and it's a friend of ours calling from New York. And she said, "Andy's been arrested." And if anyone knows Andy Stepanian, you knew that Andy got arrested all the time. So that wasn't really a big surprise. And then she said, "Well, Darius also was arrested." And that was interesting because Darius didn't get arrested that often. And she said the arrest warrants also had your name on it, myself and the 2 people we were organizing with in the house. So the nice thing about the FBI is that they only will serve arrest warrants between 6 a.m. and 9 p.m. It's kind of a courtesy, right? So we knew that they were calling from the East Coast, and we were 3 hours behind time difference. So we knew that we had 2 hours before the FBI was going to show up on our front door. So we got up and we walked the dogs, we ate breakfast, we took showers. We knew that we were going to have to go before a judge at some point, so we put on nice clothes. And I did what I thought was natural, so I went back to bed because I was tired. But sure enough, at 6 o'clock in the morning, that familiar pounding on the doors busted open, and about 20 or 30 cops in full body armor, balaclavas, guns drawn, come storming through the door, threatening to shoot the dogs. And they arrest all of us. They put us in zip ties, and they lead us out of the house, and there's helicopters overhead, and the neighbors are out wondering what the hell's going on. And then they put us in cop cars. We each got our own car, which I thought was really another nice accommodation. And they drove us down to the local grocery store about two miles away. And in that grocery store was 20 or 30 more cops and law enforcement agencies amassed in this parking lot. There's about 40, 50, 60 people to serve an arrest warrant for 3 nonviolent animal rights activists. And that was the first time it really became apparent as to how kind of terrified and frightened they were of this campaign. And I remember sitting in the back of the cop car And I looked over and I saw one of the arresting officers, and he had the full body armor on, and he had put his balaclava, he pulled it up, and he was standing there. And I was looking at him, and he turned and looked at me, and his eyes got really big. And he pulled his balaclava down really quick because he was terrified, right? Like, he thought, when I got out of prison, like, I'm coming for that guy. Like, that's the guy I'm coming after. Which was entertaining at the time, but also was interesting because it just showed how very real, like, this fear was for a lot of people. And it was the same fear that we would see witness after witness in our trial, right? Of 40 people, over 40 people in total being put on the witness stand. And they were scared of us. And it wasn't because it was something that we did. It was because the fear that they had was instilled by the FBI. The FBI had spent all this time for years going from target to target to target this campaign and saying these people are dangerous and they're violent and they're coming for you. And obviously none of that was true. But when we'd ask them on the stand, you know, you're terrified of SHAC and these individuals, and they would say yes. And they're like, well, where did you hear about SHAC? Well, the FBI told us. Well, it's very apparent, you know, that they had been building this campaign, you know, against our campaign, essentially to put us in prison. So, you know, they had instilled this sense of fear in people, and that, you know, as I said, that they thought that we were these really dangerous people. But they also used that fear to increase their surveillance as well. So they assumed that, as you know, they do that, they can't imagine that things are being run horizontally. There's no like strong leadership that people can act independently. They assumed that as who they perceived the leadership of SHAC USA was also the people that were organizing and participating in all the illegal direct action, from lab raids to spray paint to graffiti to, you know, to more aggressive home demonstrations and that sort of thing. So they used that information to go to a judge and say, we need to do more surveillance on these people and we need your permission. So they got permission to use pen tracers. And pen tracers at the time were pretty high tech, and they allowed the government, the FBI, to see where we were going on the internet. They could follow our web presence, right? So they could see what web pages we were looking at and going to, and to communicate with people. But what they didn't find is that we were doing anything illegal on the internet. And so they thought, well, surely they must be doing this illegal organizing on the phone. They must be talking to each other on the phone. So they got permission to wiretap our phones. And so they spent months, 24 hours a day, listening to all of our phone calls, listening not just to activist stuff, but also listening to personal phone conversations to our friends and our families, personal conversations we had with our partners, with our attorneys. And they recorded all of those. And when trial came and they turned those conversations over, they turned over 555 cassette tapes, 90 minutes each, just full of phone conversations for us to dig through. But the one thing they didn't find on those 555 cassette tapes were us organizing anything illegal. So they thought, surely they must be doing this face-to-face inside of their office. So a woman by the name of Lisa DiStefano, who was an old environmental activist, she called us one day and said, oh, I want to come to the office and volunteer. And that wasn't anything unusual. And we said, yeah, come on over. And she came and stayed with us in New Jersey for a few weeks. And we put her to work doing, you know, typical volunteer stuff. And at night, she would say, you know, do you mind if I walk the dogs? And we'd be like, yeah, sure. It's like super freezing outside. We don't want to walk the dogs, so help yourself. And we, do you want us to come with you? And she'd say, no, I'm going to call my sick grandmother in Philadelphia. But what she was doing was she was calling her FBI handler, which is someone in the FBI that handles infiltrators. So she was calling them and alerting them as to what was going on inside of our home and how we were organizing, who we were talking to, and the layout of the land, layout of the office, so forth and so on. But the one thing, of course, they didn't find was us organizing anything illegal. And that's how they ended up getting permission to come and raid the home. We were surely hiding this illegal organizing somehow inside of the computer, so forth and so on. Again, obviously not true. So, as I said, we were all arrested. We were indicted, and that's how we ended up becoming the SHAC 7. And it's also how this awful photo came into existence, which is terribly embarrassing. Pay no attention to my pink shirt and yellow pastel tie, which is pretty smoking hot. So the SHAC, we were the SHAC 7, which was 6 individuals and 1 organization, which was SHAC USA. So there was Kevin Jonas and Josh Harper, Andy Stepanian and Darius Fulmer, Lauren Gazzola, and myself. And we would all be charged with a variety of different crimes, dependent on how the government felt that our roles were played out in the organization. But the one thing that we were all charged with was something called the Animal Enterprise Protection Act, which has now been changed to the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. But the Animal Enterprise Protection Act in the United States says that or it said at the time of our convictions, that if you crossed state lines to disrupt a business that uses animals and you caused them more than $10,000 worth of physical damage, then you could be tried essentially as a domestic terrorist. So what they said in our case is that we didn't actually do any of that. They suggested that we crossed state lines through the internet and that we caused $10,000 worth of damage or more damage to a corporation that uses animals, but not physical damage. They said that we caused $10,000 or more worth of economic damage, that we affected their share price. And they convinced the jury that this was the language of the law, which it wasn't. And since then, they've strengthened the law into what is now called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which now says that that also does include economic damage. It does include secondary and tertiary targeting of companies that are associated with businesses that use animals. And dependent on the crime, you can get upwards of a life imprisonment for violating the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. Granted, that's if you went out and like murdered someone. But if you committed some serious felonies, you could get decades in prison simply because the crime was associated with a business that uses animals. So throughout the case, they said that we conspired with unknown people around the country to engage in acts of intimidation and threats. But the way that we did that was not by organizing it or participating in it. Rather, they said that just by simply posting about them on our webpage, and similar to what a newspaper might do, and by editorializing on that, we were conspiring and encouraging people to engage in those same types of activities. And that's why we chose to take it to trial, right? So we felt that it was our right to free speech. It was a right to report on information the same way that a newspaper was doing. And we also felt it was our right as activists to simply share ideas. In the United States, that's protected free speech. But unfortunately, that did not work out so well for us, and we were all convicted. We're all sentenced to a variety of sentences. I was sentenced to 48 months in federal prison, and I spent my time in two different prisons. One was in Victorville, California, which is like an hour and a half northeast of Los Angeles, California. And then eventually I was transferred to a place called Terminal Island, which is a prison literally on an island inside of Los Angeles Harbor. The first place was Victorville. This is the Victorville complex. There's 4 prisons. The one on the left is a U.S. penitentiary, which is like maximum security. The middle and the top right are medium security prisons, and then the upper left is a prison camp that that housed women. And I was in the one, which they call it the one, and it's beautiful outline here. It's very nice, very well landscaped, as you can tell. A lot of dirt. It was in the middle of Mojave Desert, which was not as exciting as it sounds. But Victorville was much like the movies and things you read about in books and magazines about prison. There was a lot of beatings and fights and stabbings. There were riots pretty regularly. There was gang violence. There was racial politics. And you kind of had to figure out how to navigate all of that, because obviously a person like me does not want to engage in activities like that, and nor am I going to associate myself with those kind of politics. But in a prison like that, you have to walk this very fine line of sticking to your core beliefs and not compromising them, but also not violating any basic inmate rules that are going to end up with you getting thrown to the ground by 5 guys and getting your face kicked in while they wear steel-toe boots, which also happened fairly regularly at that prison. So it was a very fast learning curve that you had to really jump on the train quick and figure out how to navigate this without compromising yourself and not getting really hurt. But the interesting thing about prison was that I think I naively thought that when I went to prison, I was going to leave that kind of activist repression side, in my wake, and I would be now as Jake Conroy, this inmate. So like I would no longer be Jake Conroy, the activist. I would be now 935011011, and that would be my new identity, and I wouldn't have to worry about that old stuff. And I found out pretty quickly that just wasn't going to be the case, that the government was going to continue to harass and put a lot of restrictions on me while I was even in prison because of my political beliefs. So the 3 things that you have when you go to prison to kind of maintain that sense of self, so that you can hopefully come out the other end of prison The same person you were as you went in with the same convictions. You have mail, phone calls, and visits, and those are the 3 connections you have to the outside world to try to keep up with relationships and partners and friendships and family. And I found out pretty quickly that those 3 things were things they were going to try to compromise and take away from me as much as they possibly could. And it started with the visiting. So when you are in prison and you want someone to come visit you, you have to fill out an application, or you take an application, you send it to the person, they fill out the form, they send it back to you, to your counselor, and the counselor reads through it and decides, if that person is eligible or able to come visit you. And there's no rhyme or reason as to why they can or cannot. Your counselor could just be in a bad mood and just not want you to have any visitors and cancel that person off your list. But for me, every single person was being denied. Every single person was told no. And when I would go ask, why am I not allowed any visitors? My counselor, her name was Miss Bennett, she would say, well, you know why. And I say, I really don't. Can you just tell me? And she said, you know why. That was her answer to everything. You know why. So the final straw for me with the visiting was my partner at the time. I obviously wanted her to come visit me in prison. And she was denied. And I went and I said, why was she denied? And she said, it's none of your business. And I said, okay. And I didn't know quite what to do, so I went and called her and I said, they're not going to let you come visit. Miss Bennett's being a real pain in the ass. She doesn't know what she's talking about, so forth and so on. And so I decided to go to her boss, her supervisor, and I went to who's what's called the unit manager. So I went to the unit manager, Mr. Jackson, and I said, Mr. Jackson, I don't understand why she would be denied. She's not a criminal. She's never been charged with anything, so forth and so on. And he said, well, I'll look into it. The next day, he came into our unit and he called out my name, Conroy, come down to my office. And I was like, okay, now we're getting somewhere. I'm getting some action, right? So we walk down there and we go into his office. And before I can sit down, I look over and there's Miss Bennett. And she's furious. And she starts screaming at me, how dare you tell me that I don't know what I'm talking about? How dare you say that I'm a pain in the ass? Blah, blah, blah. And she's screaming at me. And I sit down and I'm just kind of listening to her. And I see Mr. Jackson. He has my girlfriend's application on the front of his desk, and he's facing it towards me, and he's kind of tapping it every once in a while as Miss Bennett's screaming at me, and she's kind of like as a reminder, like, don't fuck this up. Don't fuck this up, otherwise this isn't going to happen. So I sat there and I took it. Then she started threatening me with violence. She says, I'm a big deal in this prison, and inmates respect me, and if you talk bad about me again, I'm going to make sure they come after you. She's threatening violence to me in front of her boss, and he doesn't seem to care. So I say, okay, I'm sorry, just trying to like smooth things out a little in hopes that I can get a visitor while I'm incarcerated. And so she leaves, and I get up to leave, and Mr. Jackson stops me and says, Conroy, we're listening to all your phone calls. And I'm like, yeah, I know. Like, I'm an activist. Like, you always listen to my phone calls. And he said, no, we're listening to every single one of your phone calls. And what he meant was that they had a computer, and as you made a phone call, it recorded that computer. Or, sorry, he recorded that phone call. So that every single one of those phone calls that I made were logged onto a computer. And if they wanted right now, today, they could go over and push a button on a computer and listen to the phone call I made to wish my mom a happy birthday in July of 2007. And so I thought about that, and I said, okay. I went upstairs and I got on the phone, and I called my girlfriend at the time, and I said, they're not going to let you come visit, so let's start suing them. We're going to sue everyone. Like, let's sue the Bureau of Prisons. Let's sue Mr. Jackson. Let's sue Miss Bennett. And she said, okay, I'll call the attorneys. And the next day, Mr. Jackson came up to me and said, she's approved, she can come visit. Which was great, right? So you can kind of use the system every once in a while against you. I did manage to get one other friend on my visiting list through a loophole that I kind of exploited, and it actually worked once. And it was my friend, who wasn't an activist, she was an old friend of mine from high school. And she came and visited me once, and 2 weeks later, the FBI started knocking on her door and started visiting her at work and wanting to know how she knew me. And how did she get on my visiting list? And what were we talking about? And was I passing her information to pass to other activists in Los Angeles area? That's how terrified they were that like I was going to talk to a friend, right? And how hard they were trying to stop all that. They also spent a lot of time scrutinizing my mail. The one plus side of being a political prisoner is the amazing support you get from people from all over the world. Getting thousands and thousands of letters over the course of 3.5 years was really touching and really helped me get through those experiences. And I wrote as much as I could too. I think I wrote about 1,500 letters over the course of the 3.5 years. But unfortunately, there was someone his sole job was to read all of my mail, which must have been terribly boring. But they were required to open every single letter that I received, read it and photocopy it if they felt necessary and put it in a file. And every letter that I wrote out, they read and photocopied if they needed and put it into a file. And as I said, it was someone's job just to read my mail. So what normally would take 3 or 4 days to get a letter, it would take me 3 or 4 weeks to get a letter. And if that person went on a holiday, I just wouldn't get mail. Or in one instance, the guy quit, left, quit his job, and I didn't get mail for 2 months. And I'd say like, well, where's my mail? And they're like, maybe you're just not getting any. I'm like, man, I get letters every single day. What do you mean like it just stops, right? So eventually they found someone else to do it. And one day they just brought me literally a garbage bag full of letters and newspapers and magazines and said, here's your mail. And it was, posted months prior. But that's because they honestly were terrified and scared that I was somehow organizing things through the mail. But the big kind of jarring thing came about halfway through, or excuse me, about 6 weeks into my incarceration. I was in the rec yard, and I got called into the office, and there was a woman there, and she said, well, don't shoot the messenger. And I thought, well, that's a terrible way to start a conversation, right? Especially in prison. She said, don't shoot the messenger, but I need to give you this. And she hands me this identification card that's about this big, and it's bright red. And as inmates, you're required to carry your prison ID. It's like a driver's license, kind of. It's like, small little ID card with your name and your number on it. It says inmate across the bottom. But I was required to now carry the second ID card that was big, and it was bright red, and it said high visibility inmate at the top. And she explained that it was now my duty to get up at 6:30 in the morning when they unlocked your cell and report to a correctional officer, to let them know that I hadn't escaped, right? So now it was my job to let the prison know that I hadn't escaped. And I had to do that every 2 hours, starting at 6:30 in the morning till 8:30 at night when they locked the door and locked you in for the night. The awful thing about it was I had to get up at 6:30 in the morning, and I'm not a morning person, so that was my biggest gripe about it. But the issue was that when you checked in with these officers every 2 hours, if you forgot or you couldn't find an officer because you were locked in a room, or an officer was told to call you in because they had to call your name into the control room and say, Conroy has not escaped. If he was lazy and didn't feel like doing it and they didn't get the call, they assumed I was missing. So they'll put an announcement all over the entire prison, Conroy, report to a staff member. And so you heard my name called all the time because the cops are lazy and they didn't want to do it. And so and if that didn't happen, if I still didn't report in or they didn't hear from an officer, they would recall the whole yard, right? So they'd bring 1,300 inmates, lock each one in their cell, and then go around and count each individual person to make sure that I hadn't escaped. And when they did, and if I was there, they would then send me to the solitary confinement. They'd send me to the SHU or the hole as a punishment for not being around. And so I was told, how do I get off of this thing? And she said, well, you need to go talk to the captain. So I went down and talked to the captain, and I walked up to him, and I said, Captain, my name's Conroy. And he says, I know who you are. I said, okay. And I said, I'm on this red card, and I don't understand this. And he says, well, and he starts explaining the rules. You got to check in. And I was like, I get it. I just don't understand why I'm on it. And he says, you know why, which apparently is the answer to everything in prison. He says, you know why? I said, I really don't. He says, it's because you're an eco-terrorist. And I thought, I don't mean to split hairs, but I'm more of an animal rights terrorist than an eco-terrorist. But he said, you're an eco-terrorist. And I said, okay. Well, he said, well, how do I get off of it? And he says, you don't. You're on it for your entire stay. And I said, okay. And I left. And later I would find out that inmates all have what they call jackets, right? Which is a file about who you are and what people need to be wary of. And it's hidden from you. You're not allowed to see it. Only people that can see it are cops. And for whatever reason, we had a cop that didn't care, and he read me my jacket. And it talked about how I was a domestic terrorist. It talked about how I was a computer hacker, despite the fact I have no idea how to hack a computer. It said that I was an arsonist, despite the fact that I've never been charged with or committed an act of arson. But there was all these things about me that were that was justification to classify me as a domestic terrorist within this prison system. It's frightening because you don't know what's on that jacket. You don't know what they're saying about you. Eventually, I spent 2 years fighting that red card. I spent 2 years getting my security level lowered. And eventually, I was transferred to a place called Terminal Island, which was supposed to be the greatest prison in the history of prisons because it's on the water. It's an island, apparently. I don't know what's really great about prison, but that's what everyone says. So eventually, I was granted transfer there. And you pull up in the bus, and everyone's shackled by their ankles and by their feet, and you have to walk like this, like a duck. and they march 30 guys off the bus, and you're standing there and you have to face a wall, and there's guys with shotguns all around you, and there's a guard tower with a guy with a shotgun, and everyone's all bummed and sad, and I'm over here with like a big grin on my face because over in the corner there's a patch of grass like the size of that speaker, and I look up and a pelican flew overhead, and I thought, man, this is going to be the greatest place ever. Because, you know, previously I'm living in a place like this, right? It's all dirt and cement, so water and pelicans and grass sounded pretty all right to me. So they move you all into a duck tank, or excuse me, a drunk tank, which is like a cement room, and they start processing everyone through. And they eventually they say, Conroy, and they pull me out of the cell. And it was unusual that they were pulling me out because this isn't how they did things. And everyone stopped, and everyone stared and looked at me. And I knew they were thinking what they were thinking, and that is either this person's a child molester or that person's a snitch, or possibly both. And because those are the two worst things that you can be in prison. And if you're those things, either you're going to get the living shit kicked out of you, or no one's ever going to associate with you ever again, and rightfully so. So everyone's sizing each other up, and then they pull this one person out, me, of course, and they march me over to this other holding tank with this other kind of weird guy that probably was one or two or both of those things. And they put us into this tank separately, and I say, where are you taking us? And they won't answer. And I say, we're going to the SHU, aren't we? And she says, yeah. So they march you into the SHU, down these dark hallways and into the solitary confinement, into the hole, in these little jail cells that are, you know, nothing in them except for some chipped paint, a little aluminum toilet and sink, and this steel bunk bed. And there's a shoebox-sized window at the end of the cell, but it's frosted over so you can't see out of it. But there was a little crack in it, and I could, every morning and every night, I'd put my head up and I could look through that crack, and I could see a little patch of grass with these beautiful flowers, and I watched the sunrise on them and watched the sun set on them. And I just thought, man, I got to get out of this SHU and get into some grass and some flowers. It was all I thought about. And I spent, you know, eight days or so like that, and they eventually marched me down into this interrogation room, and they said, and in this interrogation room was all the important people in prison, the associate warden, the captain, the lieutenant, and they're saying, you know, they're taking pictures and they're videotaping me, and they're saying, I don't know, we don't know what to do with you. We never had someone like you at our prison before, and we don't know what to do. And I was like, well, you can just let me out and go onto the yard, and I'll be fine. And they said, well, you know, we can't have you organizing anything. We can't have you organizing inmates. We can't have you organizing people outside of prison. We can't have people holding protests at our front gates. And I'm like, yeah, I only got 12 months to go. Like, I just want to go home. Like, I'm not here to cause any problems. And he said, if you cause any problems, we're gonna send you back to Victorville. And he said, you know what you're classified as, right? And I said, yeah, you classify me as a domestic terrorist. And he said, yeah, so you know that could cause problems for you too. And I said, I've never had any problems, and I'm not going to. So eventually they let me out of solitary confinement. I spent the last year of my incarceration watching dolphins and sea lions swim by in the ocean and playing shuffleboard and bocce ball with old mobsters and mafia people, and it was great. So after that, I was released to a halfway house in Oakland, California for 6 months, and then I was put on the 3 years of federal probation, which I got off of last year, and here I am today, pretty excited to be in Europe. So, thank you. So I don't stand up here to say, like, yeah, hey, look at me, like, look at all these great things I've done. But rather I'm here to say, you know, hey, look at me, like, if I can survive this, so can any of you. And we can all survive it, you know, but more than likely we won't need to. In the United States, thousands of people all participated in the SHAC campaign in a variety of different ways. But at the end of the day, only 6 of us ended up going to prison. And that's not to say people won't go to prison, but more than likely you won't. But if you do, right, it's not the end of the world. The animal rights movement has a long history of showing some really amazing support for its prisoners. You know, as I said, I received support and donations and letters from people from all over the world. And it helped me build that connection to the outside. It helped me be a stronger person. It helped me survive just a really terrible and awful situation. And I think that support that our political prisoners get is a real testament to the movement. And the fact that so many jailed activists do come out the other side ready to organize and be involved again is a testament to how much we embrace and support our political prisoners, which I think is really commendable. So I want to finish today by just asking 2 things of each and every one of you. The first one is when you go home to wherever that is, either tonight or when you leave the conference, and go into your bathroom and shut the door. And imagine spending years of your life like that. So this isn't Terminal Island, but this is what the inside looked like. This is the tier system that I lived on. And this is, again, not Terminal Island, but this is the cells that look almost identical to the Terminal Island cells. So imagine going into your bathroom and living there, right, for years. Because it's pretty much what it is, right? So the difference between this cell and when I lived in Terminal Island was that instead of one bunk, there was two. There was a bunk bed. And back where that sink is, there was a porcelain sink and a porcelain toilet. And then there was losing my mind, speakers, or lockers to put all your stuff in, right? So you could open up the lockers and put your stuff in there. And bars in the front like that. And I could touch both walls at the same time. Like that. And two people lived in there. And I was lucky. I only had to live like that for a year. But people live like that for a very long time, right? Eric McDavid, a prisoner in the United States who was sentenced to 21 years and change for essentially a thought crime, for conspiring, for thinking about doing an illegal direct action, which never even happened, a nonviolent direct action. For thinking about it with someone else, he received 21 years, and he's doing his time at Terminal Island, right? He's going to do decades in a place just like this. So, you know, and obviously like in Europe, you have the Blackmail 3 and the Sopka 7 and all these political prisoners that really, really desperately need your support. Because prison is a sad and lonely and terrifying place. It's depressing, despite the powerful letters that activists write from prison saying that they're encouraged and they're doing well, and I don't doubt any of that. But they also are very, in a place of you know, a very depressing surrounding. So I would really encourage each and every one of you to write a political prisoner. And unfortunately, there's a long list of people that need your support from all over the world. But take the time to look through some of those lists and find just one or two people that their case or the person kind of speaks to you, and write them a letter. And it doesn't have to be a long letter about, you know, some diatribe about your political beliefs. It's probably best that it's not. But tell them about your day and tell them about what you had for dinner. Tell them about your dog or your cat or the last camping trip that you went on. Right? Start up a conversation. And they might not be able to write you back, but know that they got it and it made their day. But if there is an opportunity for them to write you back, some really exciting and beautiful friendships could come out of that. And I think that's really powerful. But more importantly, it's going to put a smile on that person's face. And like I said, inmates have 3 opportunities to quote unquote escape prison: letters, visits, and phone calls. So the more letters you get, even if it's just for a minute or 2 minutes, those letters help you escape from prison and feel like a regular quote unquote human being again. And I think that's really important that those people think, you know, realize that they're not forgotten. So the second thing I would ask for you to do when you wake up that next day is not to fear that box, right? And not to fear that cell, because that's what they want, right? The governments and the corporations, they want you to be terrified. They want you to be so frightened that you only you know, prescribe to their version of activism because you're so terrified of the consequences that maybe you don't even become involved in activism anymore because it's so terrifying. But there's a reason that these corporations agree to these injunctions and these designated protest areas. And that's because they have no effect on them whatsoever. It's not an effective form of activism. They want you to be marginalized and they want you to be divided because it's not an effective way to be. But when we stand united in ideologies and strategies, we become this unstoppable force. And we've seen this time and time again. We've seen how the governments and corporations react and how terrified they are when they see those things. We've seen that take place in like the anti-globalization mass movements in the late 90s, how they reacted to Occupy and how they reacted to SHAC, how they react to undercover investigations. When they see labor organizers marching with environmentalists, marching with anarchists, they're terrified. And when they see grassroots activists dismantle global vivisection and financial institutions, they recognize our power. And when they see us pulling back the curtains and reveal the atrocities that are going on every single day, they're furious at that, right? So I'm not going to come up here and finish this talk by working everyone up into a frenzy and slamming my hands down on the table and telling everyone we need to go out and raid fur farms and smash the animal industrial complex and you know, dismantle the state with our bare hands. Instead, I'm going to ask you to do something that I think is a lot harder. And I think I'm going to ask you to recognize where you honestly fit into this movement. And what you come up with might not be terribly exciting. It might not be the sexiest form of activism or something that we're going to romanticize around the campfires years to come. It might not mean you get to wear a balaclava and scale walls and rescue beagle puppies or fight the cops. It means that you might not get to use fiery rhetoric on bullhorns or get pats on the back from your supporters. What it means is that you might spend days in front of a computer doing research or figuring out how to hack into a database. It means that you might be designing newsletters or doing stalls to raise money. It might be figuring out how to hide that pinhole camera or use surveillance to monitor abusers and cops. But we need to figure out what you're best at doing, right? And as I said, it might not be the most exciting thing. It might not be the most, romanticized form of activism. But we need to figure out what you're best at and how to utilize those skills to the best of your ability. So we need to find like-minded people who are complementary to these skill sets and form groups around smart strategies and actually strategize new ideas instead of using the same old failed blueprints that we've been using time and time again. And we shouldn't also be afraid to fail, because that's a great learning opportunity as well. But we need to think critically, and we need to reach out to activists who aren't just in your immediate circle, because this isn't just about animal liberation, it's not just about human liberation, it's not about the environmental liberation struggle, it's about collective liberation. And because if we all aren't free, then none of us are free. And that's more than just a catchy phrase. It's the truth. And with solid strategies, with dedication and passion, it can also be a reality. Thank you. Thank you. So I went a little long, but we have time for some...
Yeah, we do have some time for questions.
Okay, we have some time.
Yeah.
Just two things before questions. I think the question and answers are being taped, so if anyone doesn't feel comfortable asking questions in an open forum, I'll be around all weekend. I'm happy to talk to people one-on-one or small groups. Also, I have these really awesome pins that I made, and I'm trying to get a little money to cover my travel expenses, so if anyone wants to donate €1 or $2 for some rad pins, that would be awesome too. So just hit me up. Questions?
Okay.
Thank you. And I find it like kind of hard to speak after this. So, but thank you so much for everything you've done, and for all this. And I just wanted to know how your activism was limited by the state after that you were freed. And I understand that for 3 years it was different, and now you are freer. So if you could talk about that, and really thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Sure. Well, on federal probation, they put you on a probation period. They get to choose the length. For me, it was 3 years. During that time, you technically can go, you're restricted to a very small area in the country where you live, and you have to get permission to leave. You can't associate with people that have committed crimes, so I couldn't associate with any of my co-defendants until we were all off of probation. But the other big thing is you can't be arrested. So if you get arrested or you violate any of your probation, they can send you back to prison. So they can send you back to the prison to the length of your probation. So if I, say, went to a demonstration and was hassled by a cop and he even gave me a ticket and let me go, I would have to report that to my probation officer because they would find out either way. And with that, they could then determine if they wanted to send me back to prison or not. And they could send me back for the period of probation. So I could have gone back to prison for 3 years. And if they really wanted to, they could tack on another 3 years of probation after I got out that second time. And we've seen that happen in the United States with people like Rod Coronado, who's a well-known activist in America, in the United States, where he accepted a friend request on Facebook from someone that had committed crimes in the past. This guy was a founder of the Earth First movement in the United States, I think. And he was sent back to prison. He didn't even talk to the person. He just liked on Facebook, and that was the end of it. So when you're on probation, you have to be very, very careful about what you do and how you act and who you associate with. And it's very crippling on someone that wants to be active. So I found forms of, soft activism that I felt I was happy to do, and I still work on, that I knew wouldn't get me in any trouble, and I did that sort of thing. But even after you get off of probation, where I am now, and organizing in California, it's always in the back of your head, because when you have these things on your record, because of this case, I have 6 federal felonies, 4 of which in the United States they classify as violent felonies. And I also have convictions from other animal rights cases in the past, where all that adds up. So if I were to get arrested again, what might bring me 6 months or 12 months in prison would end up getting me, 5, 10 years in prison. So it's accumulative. So you just have to be, obviously, you have to be very, very careful about what you do from that point on. So yeah, it has a very crippling effect on your ability to be active, but not necessarily effective. I think there's a lot of ways to be effective, and that doesn't always mean like, being the person on the front lines, as I said, like, finding your skills and finding what you're good at and utilizing them in a broader group and strategy is really important. So it is difficult for me to go from like doing hunt sabs and, on the front lines and battling with the cops, like I said, which I'll enjoy. But I also like, I'm not bad at doing design either. So now it's like, all right, well, I don't get to do all that fun stuff, but now I have to like design like the 100th newsletter, which is awesome. But it's also really important. So it's that ability to recognize your role in the movement and how you can fit in. And it's humbling. So I don't know if that answers your question.
One more question? Okay, then.
Can you tell something about the food in prison?
Yeah. That's actually my favorite thing to talk about. I could do a whole hour-long talk on how to be vegan in prison, and that would be the best. It varies from prison to prison. In the prisons I was in, the federal government does not recognize veganism. They don't recognize special diets. So they don't care if you're vegan. When I talk to them about it, they'd be like, well, what happens if this person doesn't like onions? Now we got to make a whole meal for a guy that doesn't like onions. And I'm like, well, it's a little different, like an entire like ethical like lifestyle compared to the guy who doesn't like onions. But they don't care, So, but the interesting thing about prison, which I hate to say I actually liked about prison, was that everything is for sale on the black market, right? So there's a commissary, there's a store where you can go and buy like tortillas or beans and a handful of vegan food that's just accidentally vegan, and you can survive on that, and it's awful. But you can't get fresh produce. Nothing like that is available. It's only available in the kitchen, and you're not allowed to take food out of the kitchen into the unit. So you pay people to steal it for you. And currency in prison are postage stamps. So one postage stamp is worth 25 US cents, right? So green pepper might be 3 postage stamps. So you shoot the guy 3 postage stamps, and he shoves a pepper down his pants, and he walks out and hopes that he doesn't frisk you, and the cops don't frisk you, and then you wash it a lot, and then you eat it. So, so there's an interesting way. It's beyond just like what you can get on the black market. It's how you get those postage stamps to use as currency, right? So everyone either has a hustle or they're being hustled. So I don't like to be hustled, so I had hustles, right? It's to earn money, to earn postage stamps. So I would earn all this money, and I ran a store out of my locker, so I would sell food out of my locker. And people would pay me postage stamps. I did people's homework, and like, I'd make them pay like $75 for the postage stamps to complete like a semester's worth of college courses for someone. And then I would take all that and I would use the postage stamps to eat like a king. And I ate pretty well. And on top of that, like my store was so successful that I was making maybe $100, $200 a week. And I would use $100 of that to restock my store. And I'd use the other $100 to like party with, right? So, and for like the straight edge vegan guy, that means like green peppers and like sugar cubes. So, but you could get anything in prison. You can get drugs, you can get meth, you can get tattoos done, you can drink, alcohol straight from the bottle, do all those things at the same time. Like as long as you can afford it, you can get it. But, the other great thing about prison is free healthcare, which we don't really have in the United States. So I got my blood work done all the time. Like I'd go and ask for my blood results, and like I had perfect health the entire time I was in prison because you have nothing but time. So you exercise a lot, and then you figure out where your next meal is going to come from. So I would just make all these awesome vegan food. I got people to go vegetarian and vegan while I was in prison, and like I don't mean to like take too much time, but there was a guy that like in prison there's shot callers, right? So there's one person that runs the prison yard for their entire race. So because everything's racially divided. So there's one guy that like is in charge of all the white guys and one guy of all the black guys. And the guy that was in charge of the shot caller for the black guys was this really radical guy. And so we started talking about politics and the Black Panther Party, and and his mom had dated like Huey P. Newton, the founder of the Black Panther Party. So we became good friends, and I started talking to him about animal issues, and like he ended up going vegetarian. And so like me and like the shot caller, the head of all the black guys in prison, we would like sit down and make like vegan meals together. So it was interesting, but yeah.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank you for this very interesting talk, and I'm sure lots of people will want to talk to you some more about this.
Sure. Thank you.
So, thank you very much.